Well, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said earlier this week that America's relationship with China is on a stronger footing after her trip to Beijing. But the two countries' relations are more strained than we've seen in a while. A journey charted in the new podcast, Face Off, the U.S. versus China. So joining me now to talk more about this is the Face Off host and senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, Jane Perlez. Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very good to be with you this afternoon.
Sum up your takeaways from Yellen's recent trip to China and whether or not it was a step in the right direction.
Definitely. Better to talk and jaw than war. And I think it's also important that Janet Yellen is respected by the Chinese. She's seen as an academic economist, not as a political appointee who's just come from Wall Street and then will go away. They've known her for a long time. And they welcomed her for more than 4 days, which is a long time for a trip by a senior American official. And while things are not sunny and nothing was resolved, they did resolve to continue talks.
So I know Yellen had said that the U.S. hasn't ruled out the possibility of tariffs. That was something that we heard a lot about during former President Trump's administration. But why are we finding that this administration is concerned about China's production of certain technology, especially green technology?
Well, I think American executives, American business executives, American politicians, and the public are concerned that that China could flood the market here with cheaply produced solar panels, cars. Their electric cars have not arrived in the United States yet, but I think people are anticipating something like that. And I think there's a concern that there is overcapacity in China, which they may flood the market in the United States and around the world and destabilize global markets. That's the problem.
Well, we saw President Biden speak recently with President Xi Jinping and the two leaders meeting in California. That was about 5 months ago. How would you categorize that relationship?
Well, in our podcast, Face Off, we do talk about, one whole episode, the relationship between Xi Jinping and Biden. It goes back to 2011. That's a long time for two leaders, particularly the two major superpowers. They first met on a basketball court in China in 2011 when they were both vice presidents. And they seemed to get along. And then in 2012, then Vice President Xi Jinping came to Washington, and I was at the State Department dining room when he was welcomed by then Vice President Biden and Secretary of State Clinton for a very fancy 200-person lunch, where I should add, everybody who was anybody in the China relations universe was there. Henry Kissinger, Bob Zelek, lots of ambassadors, lots of Chinese. Everybody had a smile on their face because they thought that Xi Jinping would be a great reformer. Well, how wrong could they be? They got it completely wrong, as we have discovered since he took power a few months later.
Well, I see here that the first episode of your podcast looks at the military tensions that we've seen between the U.S. and China that really have spanned decades here. How would you categorize those?
Well, those military tensions in the South China Sea have been building, actually, ever since Xi Jinping came on that visit to Washington in 2012. It was only a couple of years later that he started building what are called artificial islands in the South China Sea, where the Chinese just unilaterally expanded existing small sand atolls and unilaterally built them into quasi-military bases. So now these islands have got all kinds of military capacities for the United States, and that puts the American Navy and American assets in a difficult position. And I think there's a lot of argument about whether those islands are even legal. There's a lot of tensions between the two militaries, in part because the Chinese Navy has become very strong. They have more vessels than the United States Navy. Their Air Force is growing. And China has made it quite clear that they consider the South China Sea theirs, not an international waterway. So that makes for very, very tense relations, which is something that we highlight in the first episode of our podcast called Spies in the Skies.
Interesting. Okay, well then let's now move to the second episode, because that also takes a look at something that Americans know well, and that's Apple, specifically China's relationship with Apple, which we would like to learn more about. We had seen, in fact, a new report that said Apple produced $14 billion of iPhones in India the past year, and Apple and actually many other companies, many market experts that I bring on the show have said that they see India as a real opportunity here. What do you think is the path going forward for China and Apple, and what would that mean for Americans?
Well, it's a very interesting story, and I think in our podcast we have two excellent guests who describe this Apple saga. The first is Willy Shih, who is a professor at the business school here at Harvard, who describes the supply chain that Apple relies on to build the iPhones in China. And our second guest is Wayne Ma, who worked in China for the Wall Street Journal for many years and is now with The Information, the tech platform in San Francisco. And they both point out that there's a lot of pressure on Apple from Washington to disentangle itself somewhat, perhaps not completely because that's unrealistic, but to disentangle themselves from what has been until now pretty much a happy marriage. A marriage, one could say, between two very secretive organizations. Apple, which is quite a secretive corporation, and the Chinese Communist Party, that is definitely a secretive organization. But they've worked it out well over the last number of years, since 2007 or so, when the iPhone first came. There are millions of Chinese workers working under contract for Foxconn, which is a major Taiwanese-based manufacturer that organizes everything for Apple. But that relationship is beginning to fray. I think that Apple is looking, as you mentioned, to produce in India. But that's going to be difficult because while India has many workers, they have a bigger population than China now, the Indian workers don't have the discipline or the tech skills that Chinese workers have. Another place where Apple could diversify to is Vietnam, which is right next to China, of course. But that's a smaller population. They have the tech skills, but they don't have the scale. You know, you have to remember, the scale of the Apple factories in China is just incredible. 300,000 workers in one plant. That's the size of Tampa, Florida. And that's not easy to replicate. So Tim Cook was in a very generous mood towards the Chinese leaders when he was there a couple of weeks ago. He went to the opening of an Apple store in Shanghai. He caroused around on video with one of China's most famous pop stars. He really tried to make the relationship look very firm. For the moment, it's intact, but let's see what it's going to be like going down the road, in part because the Chinese government has told its government employees not to take iPhones to their workplace. And that, in part, is one reason why Apple sales have dropped in the last couple of months. Chinese workers are now turning up to their government offices with Chinese-made phones, Huawei and Xiaomi, which are very well made, have super chips in them, much faster than people expected.
Interesting. I think we only have time for one more question, Jana. We could spend a whole lot more time picking your brain and learning from you here today. But we talk a lot about TikTok and this potential TikTok ban. And I would be curious to get your take as to your own thoughts on TikTok.
Well, there's a lot of rhetoric, and I suppose some of it's backed up in Washington. I suppose a lot of it's backed up in Washington about how TikTok is a danger to the United States because it offers a backdoor to Chinese authorities because TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a major Chinese company. I mean, personally, I feel that the United States is a big country, it's a democratic country, and there must be ways that it can solve this problem, that it just doesn't unilaterally shut down TikTok. I know there are many sides to this equation, and of course, American assets, American platforms are not permissible in in China. For example, the New York Times, where I worked in Beijing for 7 years, is there. Our platform was closed a few years ago. The Washington Post is not available. The Wall Street Journal not available on anybody's iPhones in China. So they do close down ours, but I'm not so sure that that means that the United States has to do tit for tat on everything.
All right, Jane Perlez, Senior Fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Jane, we really appreciate it. And you can check new episodes of Face Off, U.S. versus China, released weekly.